You wake before dawn. The air smells of salt and smoke. From the walls of your city, you can see the sea turning red beneath the rising sun. Ships. Too many ships. You are a god of the great king. A servant of an empire that calls itself eternal. Behind you stand palaces layered with gold. Storerooms swollen with grain. Tablets impressed with the records of tribute from lands you will never see. Ahead of you, the horizon is moving. You were taught that the world has an order. That the gods placed your king above all others. That caravans will always arrive from the east. That copper will come from Cyprus. That tin will come from distant mountains. That scribes will record. That farmers will sow. That priests will chant. That tomorrow will resemble yesterday. But this morning feels different. The messengers arrived in the night, breathless, whispering of cities burned to their foundations. Of the mighty Hattusa, fallen silent. Of the palaces of Mycenae abandoned. Of trade ships that never reached you. You were told these were rumors. Exaggerations carried by frightened men. Yet now the sea itself seems to confirm them. The ships do not fly familiar banners. They carry families. Ox carts. Weapons stacked like kindling. They are not merchants. They are not envoys. They are moving entire worlds across the water. Your commander says they are raiders. Barbarians. Sea peoples. But why would barbarians bring children? Why would invaders travel with the old? The horns begin to sound. Behind you, priests rush toward the temple. They burn incense. They chant to gods who once promised protection. You grip your spear and wonder something you were never meant to ask. If empires are blessed by heaven, why do they tremble like this? If the world is ordered, why does it suddenly feel fragile? Within a single generation, cities that stood for centuries will be ash. Kings will vanish. Scripts will be forgotten. Trade routes will dissolve into silence. And you, standing on this wall, will not know that you are witnessing the end of an age. How does a world collapse? Not slowly, but all at once. And what happens to the people inside it when the system they trusted simply breaks? The world you stand in did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, patiently, layer by layer. For centuries, kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean wove themselves into a single living system. From the palace archives of Hattusa to the citadels of Mycenae, from the temples of Thebes to the bustling port of Ugarit. Power moved through letters, caravans, marriages, and ships. Kings called each other brother. They exchanged daughters as brides. They sent gifts of gold, lapis lazuli, ivory, and chariots. This was not a primitive world. It was globalized, and it was tightly connected. In your city, life begins with the palace. The palace is not merely a residence. It is a machine. Scribes sit cross-legged, pressing reeds into wet clay. Each tablet records shipments of grain, allocations of oil, counts of livestock. Craftsmen hammer bronze into spearheads and plowshares. Women weave fine textiles dyed with precious purple, extracted from crushed shells. Every task feeds the center, and the center redistributes survival. But bronze is not born in your soil. Copper comes from Cyprus. Tin travels from lands beyond your maps. Without both, there is no bronze. Without bronze, there are no swords, no plows, no empire. Your world depends on distances you will never see, and everyone knows it. Across the sea, the warriors of Mycenae build fortresses of massive stone. They ruled from hilltop palaces protected by walls so large. Later generations will call them the work of giants. They raid, they trade, they compose epics that will one day echo in poems attributed to Homer. They send ships south toward the rich Nile Delta, and there in the land of Egypt, the pharaoh stands as a living god. Under rulers like Ramesses II, monuments rise from desert sands. Temples are carved into cliffs. Reliefs celebrate victories over rivals from Hatti. Yet even Egypt, powerful and ancient, depends on this same network. Cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, horses from the north. No kingdom is alone. Each is a pillar. Together, they hold up an age. Merchants sail predictable routes. Season after season, they know which harbors offer safe anchorage, which kings demand tribute, which roads are guarded. Contracts are honored because reputation is survival. A drought in one region can be balanced by surplus in another. A war between two kings is contained by alliances with others. Diplomacy is as essential as grain. Letters travel in cuneiform across hundreds of miles, pleading for gold, requesting aid, arranging marriages between royal houses. The system flexes. It absorbs tension. It adapts. But beneath the order lies fragility. Crop failures have begun in some regions. Earth tremors have shaken cities near the fault lines. Nomadic groups displaced by hunger push towards settled lands. Piracy increases along vulnerable coasts. Each disruption alone is manageable. Together, they begin to strain the web. And when a web is stretched too tight, what happens if even one thread snaps? The first signs do not look like the end of the world. They look like politics. A delayed shipment, a tense letter, a request for aid that goes unanswered. In the archives of Ugarit, a king writes in urgency. Enemy ships have appeared offshore. The city's forces are away. He asks allies for help. The tone is not dramatic. It is administrative. But beneath the clay impressions lies fear. The network is beginning to fail. In Hattusa, the great king rules over a vast Anatolian empire. Vassal states send tribute. Chariot divisions patrol the frontiers. Diplomats negotiate with rivals like Egypt. This is a superpower of its age. Yet maintaining it requires constant balance. Local rulers must feel respected. Borders must remain secure. Harvests must feed armies. Reports arrive of unrest in Western territories. Some vassals refuse tribute. Others are attacked by unknown groups moving inland. The empire stretches troops thin. To defend one frontier is to weaken another. What happens when strength becomes overextension? Across the Aegean, the palace centers of Mycenae and Pylos operate through rigid control. Everything is catalogued. Bronze allocations, chariot parts, rations for workers. The elite warrior class depends on centralized redistribution. But when trade routes falter, bronze becomes scarce. Without bronze, elite identity begins to fracture. Warriors may begin to serve themselves. Internal tensions grow. Rival factions compete for shrinking resources. And when palaces burn, the destruction looks deliberate. Was it invasion or revolt from within? In the Nile Delta, under Ramesses III, reliefs at Medinet, Habu depict fierce battles. Foreign warriors arrive by land and sea. They bring families in ox-drawn carts. They carry round shields and long swords. Egypt calls them the Sea Peoples. The inscriptions proclaim victory. The pharaoh stands triumphant. Yet even victory reveals vulnerability. Grain shortages plague the land. Workers strike for rations. Laborers lay down their tools. The divine order shows cracks. If Egypt must fight to preserve its borders, if Hatti struggles to control its vassals, if Mycenaean palaces burn, then perhaps the crisis is not local. Perhaps it is systemic. Climate shifts bring prolonged drought to parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Tree rings, centuries later, will whisper of it. Famine pushes migrations spark conflict. Trade collapses in one port, causing shortages in another. Shortages fuel rebellion. Rebellion invites invasion. The system that once absorbed shocks now amplifies them. A world optimized for efficiency has little redundancy. When caravans stop, cities starve. When authority falters, loyalty dissolves. When fear spreads, violence accelerates. The web begins to tear in multiple places at once. And no king, no matter how divine, can hold every thread together. Is this how civilizations end? Not by a single blow, but by cascading failure. The fires do not announce themselves as history. They begin as smoke on the horizon. A farmhouse burning. A warehouse looted. A road no longer safe to travel. Then entire cities ignite. In Ugarit, flames consume archives, still filled with unanswered letters. Tablets bake in the inferno, preserving desperate words for millennia. The king's final plea for reinforcements never receives a reply, because the ships that might have carried help never arrive. The harbor falls silent. In Anatolia, the great capital of Hattusa is abandoned. No triumphant conqueror leaves monuments behind. The administrative heart simply stops beating. Granaries stand empty. Temples deserted. Royal seals unused. The empire that once rivaled Egypt dissolves into scattered settlements. Villages shrink. Trade routes vanish into overgrown paths. Literacy declines. The knowledge required to maintain complexity begins to fade. What happens when a society forgets how it functioned? Across the Aegean, the palaces of Mycenae and Tyrians burn. Their massive stones remain, but the bureaucratic system collapses. Linear B script disappears. Not because it was outlawed, but because no one needs it anymore. Without centralized redistribution, there is nothing left to record. Warrior elites fragment into local chieftains. Communities retreat to defensible hills. Population declines follow, not always from slaughter, often from hunger, from displacement, from the quiet erosion of stability. Children grow up without knowing that their grandparents lived in a far more connected world. Even Egypt, resilient and ancient, changes. After the reign of Ramesses III, the new kingdom weakens. Foreign trade contracts, central authority erodes, regional leaders gain autonomy. The age of vast imperial campaigns ends. Egypt survives, but diminished. Turned inward, survival becomes more important than dominance. For ordinary people, collapse is not a dramatic moment. It is adaptation. A farmer who once paid taxes in grain now defends his own field with a spear. A merchant who sailed predictable routes abandons the sea for inland barter. A scribe, trained for years in complex scripts, finds no patron to employ his skill. He becomes a laborer. A priest questions why rituals no longer guarantee protection. Faith shifts. Myths evolve. Old gods are reinterpreted. New identities form in the vacuum of lost empires. The interconnected Bronze Age world fractures into smaller, localized societies. Trade becomes regional. Architecture simpler. Political power decentralized. For centuries, the Mediterranean enters what later historians will call a dark age. Not because people vanish, but because records do. Memory shrinks. And yet, within this collapse, lie seeds of transformation. Iron begins to replace bronze. Smaller communities experiment with new forms of governance. Out of the ruins of Mycenaean centers will eventually rise the city-states of archaic Greece. From weakened Levantan cities will emerge maritime traders who will sail farther than their predecessors. But none of that is visible to the guard on the wall. To him, this is simply loss. The end of certainty. The end of a world that believed itself eternal. And the question lingers, unanswered in the smoke, was this destruction inevitable? Or did the very success of the system make its collapse unavoidable? You survived, not because your empire did, but because you adapted. The palace where you once stood is gone. Its archives buried. Its banners rotted by time. The gods you feared are remembered only in fragments. The king who called himself eternal has no descendants on the throne, and yet, you endure. Your children farm smaller fields. They trade locally. They forge iron instead of bronze. They do not know the vast web that once connected Hattusa, Mycenae, Ugarit, and Egypt into a single living system. To them, that world is myth. The sea peoples were not a single monster. Drought was not a lone villain. Rebellion was not the only spark. Collapse came from convergence. Climate stress, migration, overextended empires, rigid centralization, interdependence without resilience. A system optimized for efficiency, but fragile under pressure. The Bronze Age did not fall because people were weak. It fell because complexity outran stability, because networks that create prosperity can also transmit shock, because power concentrated at the center can fail all at once. And this is the question that echoes beyond 1200 BC. When we build vast systems, economic, political, technological, do we also build the resilience to protect them? Or do we assume, as every ancient king did, that tomorrow will resemble yesterday? The god on the wall believed his world was permanent. So did the scribes of Ugarit. So did the warriors of Mycenae. So did the great kings of Hatti. They could not imagine a century without their order. Yet within decades, their interconnected age was memory. Civilizations rise through cooperation. They expand through ambition. They thrive on exchange. But when stress multiplies and trust fractures, even the mightiest systems can unravel. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of humanity. It was the end of a way of organizing power. And from its ashes, new cultures emerged. New myths formed. New political experiments began. History did not stop. It transformed. The real question is not why they fell. It is whether we recognize the warning. Because somewhere, in every age, there is always a god on a wall, watching ships gather on the horizon, believing the world beneath his feet cannot possibly disappear. And yet, it can.